William Shakespeare, a very familiar name in English literature. So, in order to celebrate the legacy of William Shakespeare, let us now discuss today about Shakespearean tragedy. So, today I will discuss what is Shakespearean tragedy, what is Aristotle's concept of tragedy, and the features of Shakespearean tragedies. In order to know about Shakespearean tragedy, at first we have to know that what is tragedy, what is the definition of tragedy, or which type of dramas are called tragedy. So, a tragedy is basically a genre of drama which is dealing with some tragic or distressing or even terrifying events which has unhappy as well as tragic endings. That ending is actually brought down by the hero's own character flaws. And here we have to know another important thing about tragedy, which is tragedy or the idea of tragedy as a dramatic art came from the ancient Greece to this Christian Europe, okay, along with Renaissance. So actually Renaissance helped to introduce tragedy to Christian Europe as well as popularize it, okay. So we can say that in England, the tragic art was transmitted through Seneca. Friends, in this context, let me tell you one thing that in my channel, you will also find other videos on tragedy, such as Aristotle's views on tragedy, then types of dramas, then Aristotle's views on tragic hero, etc. So please check out the link in the description box and just fill up your knowledge. So now we have to know that what is Aristotle's concept of tragedy and tragic hero. Okay. So Aristotle in his book called Poetics described that tragedy is an imitation of a noble and complete action which through compassion and fear produces purification of the passions. Effecting the proper purgation means catharsis of those emotions. So, friends, here basically Aristotle wants to say that tragedy is a form of drama that is actually based on human suffering. And in tragedy, you'll find some tragic events, some distressing events. And one of the most important features of tragedy is that tragedy has an unhappy ending always, okay? And in tragedy, through the horrifying events, through the suffering of the tragic protagonist, these things actually produces a feeling of pity and fear in audience's mind. So this is the definition of Aristotle regarding tragedy. So now let us know that how Aristotle defines tragic hero. So about tragic hero, Aristotle is of the opinion that tragedy depicts the downfall of basically good person through some fatal error or misjudgment, producing suffering and insight on the part of protagonist and arousing pity and fear on the part of audience. So basically it means that in tragedy the protagonist is at first good but he is actually misdirected by some fatal errors and that error is basically his own character flaws, okay, and that flaw in his character actually leads him to his downfall, okay. So now we have Shakespearean tragedies. So what is Shakespearean tragedy? That is our question today. So the tragedies which are written by William Shakespeare, and we can say that the tragedies which are written by other playwrights in the style of William Shakespeare are called Shakespearean tragedy. In this context about Shakespearean tragedy, A.C. Bradley, in the book called Shakespearean Tragedies, remarked that a Shakespearean tragedy is a story of human action producing exceptional calamity in the death of man in high caste. So, from this quotation, it is clear that in Shakespearean tragedy, you will find the actions of a high class protagonist and his sufferings or downfall, okay. So though William Shakespeare followed Aristotle's concept of tragedy or Aristotelian tradition, but he had his own touch in creating magnificent tragedies. In his tragedies we may also find Senecan traditions. So A.C. Bradley classified Shakespearean tragedy in three parts. First one is exposition, then conflict, then catastrophe. So Shakespeare's heroes are actually noble by birth, or you can say they possess a high status, high class. And all the actions of a Shakespearean tragedy revolves around the life and action of these high class heroes. The heroes have some flaws in their character and they are instigated by fate and at last they meet up with the tragic death. Okay. But in most of Shakespearean tragedies, the death come to the heroes more as a relief than as a punishment. So friends, now just take a look on the list of Shakespearean tragedies. Actually, Shakespeare wrote total 10 tragedies. So these are the list of Shakespearean tragedies. Just take a screenshot and read it if needed. So now let's come to the main point, that what are the characteristics of Shakespearean tragedies. So there are actually various characteristics of Shakespearean tragedies. So at first we have the characteristic of the tragic hero and the tragic flaw in the hero's character. So friends, as we all know that in most of Shakespearean tragedies, the central character is a hero. And the entire action of the play revolves around him. And the hero is obviously noble by birth and he has some character flaws. That is also called hamartia. For which and for that flaw in his character, he suffers much and becomes the victim of a tragic ending. So, in order to prove this feature, we have some example of Shakespeare's tragedies. Okay. So, at first we have Macbeth. So, in the tragedy called Macbeth, the central hero or protagonist we can say is Macbeth, and he is in high rank, mean he is an army general. But his hamartia is his high ambition or greed. That is his actually character flaw, and that flaw leads him to his downfall. Similarly, we have the character of Hamlet in the tragedy called Hamlet. So, Hamlet was the prince of Denmark, and his noble inaction means his indecisiveness, his procrastination proves as his hamartia, which not only leads him to his downfall but also ended others' lives. Okay. Likewise, this Othello in the tragedy called Othello, Julius Caesar in the tragedy called Julius Caesar, King Lear in the tragedy called King Lear, and Antony in the tragedy called Antony and Cleopatra are the victim of their own character flaws, which finally leads them into their downfall. After this, we have another characteristic feature that is called the treatment of women in the tragedy of William Shakespeare. So, women in Shakespearean tragedies demonstrate his own feelings about women and their roles in the society of that contemporary time where they had less freedom than their male counterparts and where they were underestimated. Okay. And in many of William Shakespeare's tragedy, William Shakespeare shows high-born ladies, even the women in powers, and they are also treated with utmost distrust. For example, Gertrude in the tragedy called Hamlet marries her husband's brother Claudius, and Claudius is actually the murderer of Gertrude's husband. Then we have Lady Macbeth in Macbeth who actually pushes her husband to do a murder. After this we have the role of fate or destiny in Shakespearean tragedy. So Shakespearean tragedy is also called as a tragedy of both destiny and the tragedy of character. Shakespeare believed that man is the architect of his own fate. It means that man is the creator of his own fate or destiny. And in Macbeth, after the murder of King Duncan, Macbeth suffers the tortures of hell. And the characters are found in Macbeth in trouble due to fate. Okay. Even in Othello, Desdemona means Othello's wife dropped her handkerchief by mistake or by chance in the garden, and by chance it was picked up by Emilia and was further handed to Iago, and Iago then misleads Othello towards Desdemona, which finally leads Othello to murder or to kill his own wife. After this, we have the conflict, or we can say internal or external conflict in Shakespearean tragedies. So most of Shakespeare's William Shakespeare's plays are shaped by internal and external conflict. The major action of Shakespearean tragedy always develops through conflict, okay? And in most of his tragedies, we see the conflict of passions, the conflict of ideas and principles, rather than the conflict of persons, okay? And in addition, this conflict leads to the heroes to feel or to suffer the agonies of hell. For example, in Hamlet, Hamlet delays in taking revenge from his uncle Claudius, and finally, in the last scene, he takes the revenge. That revenge, that duel fight, is called external conflict. On the other hand, internal conflict means the conflict within the heart of the protagonist. It means that Hamlet has a conflict in his heart that whether it is right to take revenge or not, or what is the right time to take revenge on Claudius. And as he in one soliloquy said that to be and not to be, that is the question. This line actually proves his internal conflicts. After this, we have another feature that is called supernatural elements. So, in most of William Shakespeare's plays, there we can see the presence of supernatural elements which basically shaped the entire play. The supernatural elements means the spirits, ghosts, the using of witches, omens, superstitions, these things. And actually, these things play a very important role in shaping the whole play or in pushing the hero to the path of evil and bloodshed from the path of good deeds. After this, we have the use of irony in Shakespearean tragedies. So, irony, which is a literary device, we can say, is a powerful weapon of a writer which creates the dramatic effect in a play. It is a situation, an irony is a situation in which the author shares the knowledge of which the character is ignorant of. It means that the author and the audience knows what is going to be or what is the real nature or character of one person, but the other characters means actually or basically the hero or the central protagonist do not know about it. Okay, for example, in Othello, the audience is aware of the cunning nature of Iago, but Othello calls him honest person. After this, we have the feature of comic reliefs. It means that the use of comic elements or comic scenes in the play. Okay, for example, we have Porter's scene in Macbeth, and we can also call Gravedigger scene in Hamlet as a comic relief. After this, we have another characteristic feature of Shakespearean tragedy that is called gripping catastrophe. Okay, and after the gripping catastrophe, we have poetic justice. Poetic justice means that in a play the good deed should be rewarded and evil deed should be punished. But actually, Shakespearean tragedies lack this feature because in his tragedies we find that good deeds are crushed because they are merited by their faults. So, lastly, we have another important characteristic that is called redemption or catharsis. So, redemption means that at the end of the play, we find a remarkable change in the main characters. So, Shakespearean tragedy also follows the tradition of Aristotelian concept of catharsis. It means that the feeling of emotion, pity, and fear in the reader's as well as audience's mind. So, towards the end of the play, the protagonist laments and they gain sanity, and then the protagonist dies a tragic death. So, yeah, friends, these are all the features of Shakespearean tragedies. I really hope that this video is definitely gonna prove helpful to you all. And if it is, then please give it a like, share this video, subscribe to my channel. So, bye for now. See you in the next session very soon.